My name is Dorothy Eileen Marsh. I am 68 years old, and I live alone in a ground-floor apartment on Birch Street in Kellerton, Ohio. It is a decent apartment, the kind that suits a woman who has stopped requiring more than she needs. 2 bedrooms. I use one for sleeping and one for the sewing machine, and the boxes I have never fully unpacked from the house where I lived for 31 years. A small kitchen that faces the parking lot instead of a garden, which I notice every morning and have decided to simply accept. A front door that sticks in wet weather, which is most weather in Ohio from October through April. I moved here 14 months ago after Frank died. Frank had been my husband for 34 years, and then for 11 months he had been my husband who was dying, and then on a Wednesday in September he was simply gone, and I was 67 years old, and alone in a house with a garden I could no longer manage, and 3 bedrooms that had grown too quiet to justify. My daughter Karen helped me find the apartment. She was practical about it in the way that people are practical when they are frightened and don't want to show it. She brought measuring tape and a notebook. She said the parking was better than I thought. I said, yes, you're right, because she needed to be right about something. After Frank died, I did not do well for a while. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I ate poorly and slept at odd hours and talked to the television in the evenings, which Frank would have found hilarious and which I found embarrassing when I caught myself doing it. I called Karen too often and then felt guilty and called her less and then felt lonely and called her again. I walked to the end of the street and back every morning because the doctor had said I should walk, not because I wanted to. I said I was fine in the particular way that means you are surviving, and not much more than that. The people in Kellerton are kind. They brought food in the first weeks. The woman next door, whose name I still do not know because I have not tried hard enough to learn it, knocked once to say she was sorry for my loss, and I thanked her, and we have smiled at each other in the parking lot ever since, without either of us pushing any further, which suits both of us, I think. This is the condition I had settled into. Not unhappy in any dramatic way, not happy either, just present. That was the condition I was in on the 14th of January, the coldest night of the year so far, when I heard something at my front door. I want to be precise about the time because it matters. It was 11:37 at night. I know because I had just looked at the clock on the microwave, the way I do when I cannot sleep and want to measure how much of the night remains. I was in the kitchen in my robe making chamomile tea and thinking about nothing in particular, which is a skill I have developed since Frank died. The sound was not a knock. It was smaller than that, a specific kind of small sound that I could not immediately identify. A scratch and then a pause and then the scratch again. I stood still for a moment. Then I went to the door. On my front step, in the January cold that had been sitting below freezing since Thursday, sat a cat. She was not a kitten. That was the first thing I noticed. She was a full-grown cat, which I would later learn was somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. Old for a stray, old enough to have history. Gray and white with a coat that had once been well kept and was now matted in places from weather and time. Thin, but not the desperate thinness of an animal that has never been fed. More the thinness of one that used to be fed regularly and hasn't been for a while. She sat very still on my step and looked up at me with yellow-green eyes that were completely direct, the way cats' eyes are when they have decided something. She was not crying. She was not performing need. She was simply sitting there, looking at me in the cold. I said, out loud, to a cat on my doorstep at 11:37 in the evening, "Where did you come from?" She blinked once. That was all. I am not a cat person. I want to be clear about this, because it is relevant. Frank had been allergic, mildly but consistently, and so we had never had a cat, and I had never particularly missed having one. I had always thought of myself as the kind of person who appreciated other people's animals without wanting the responsibility of my own. I had also thought of myself, until 14 months ago, as the kind of person who had a husband. Both of these things had turned out to be negotiable. I looked at the cat. The cat looked at me. Behind me, the apartment was warm, and the kettle had just boiled. I said, "You'd better come inside." She walked past me through the door without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for the invitation and had known it would come. She went directly to the kitchen, which was practical of her, since that was where the warmth was, and sat down in the middle of the floor and looked at me expectantly. I found a can of tuna in the cupboard. I put some on a saucer. She ate it carefully, not frantically. the eating of an animal that has manners and simply happens to be very hungry. When she was done, she sat back and cleaned her face with the deliberateness of someone who knows how things should be done. I was in the process of deciding what to do with her when I saw the collar. It was almost hidden by the matted fur around her neck. A narrow blue collar, the kind that has a small barrel-shaped tag rather than a flat disc. I had to hold her still to get a look at it, which she permitted with the patience of a cat who has been handled before and trusts the process. The barrel was plastic, the pale blue of something that had once been brighter, and when I unscrewed it I found a small roll of paper inside, the kind that sometimes comes in these collars for an owner's contact information. There was a name, Pearl, and below the name, a phone number with a Kellerton exchange. And below that, in very small handwriting, a single additional line that I had to hold the paper closer to read. It said, "If you find Pearl, please take care of her. I won't be coming back." I sat down on the kitchen floor with the cat, with Pearl, and read those 9 words 3 more times. Someone had written that note and put it in this collar and let this cat out into the world, knowing they were not coming back for her. And Pearl had walked through the January cold until she found a lit window and a door she could scratch at, and that door had been mine. I held the paper for a long time. Then I put the number in my phone. It was nearly midnight, far too late to call. I told myself I would call in the morning. Pearl jumped into my lap. She was heavier than she looked, and warmer than I expected. She arranged herself with the practiced efficiency of a cat who has been a lap cat before and turned twice and settled with her chin on my knee. I sat on the kitchen floor for a while longer. The tea had gone cold. The clock on the microwave read 11:59. I did not feel lonely for the first time in 14 months. I called the number the next morning. It was a Friday. I sat at the kitchen table with Pearl on the chair beside me. She had slept at the foot of my bed, which I had not intended to permit and had been too tired to prevent, and I dialed. It rang 4 times. I was preparing to leave a message when someone answered. The voice was a man's. Older, perhaps 70, with the particular quality of a voice that has not spoken to many people recently. Slightly formal, slightly careful, as though the speaker was remembering the protocol. He said, "Hello?" I said, "I'm sorry to call out of the blue. My name is Dorothy Marsh. I live on Birch Street in Kellerton. I found a cat last night, gray and white, yellow-green eyes. There was a collar with this number on it." There was a silence, not a short one. Then he said, "Pearl." I said, "Yes. She's here. She's safe. She ate tuna last night and slept in my bedroom, which I hadn't planned." Another silence. Then, very quietly, he said, "She always did know how to make herself comfortable." Something in the way he said it told me several things at once. That this cat had been loved, that the person who had loved her was no longer in a position to do so, and that he was the person who had written the note. I said, carefully, "The note in her collar said you wouldn't be coming back." He said, "Yes." I waited. He said, "My wife passed away in November. Pearl was her cat. I don't know how to explain this simply. I'm not able to keep her. I live in a building that doesn't allow pets. I tried to find someone to take her, but I didn't want her to go to strangers, and she kept getting out. She was always an outdoor cat, and I thought if I left it long enough she'd find someone on her own. Eleanor always said Pearl had good judgment about people." He stopped. I could hear that the last sentence had cost him something. I said, "Eleanor was your wife?" He said, "Yes. 39 years. I said, "My husband Frank died 14 months ago." 34 years. The silence this time was different. The particular silence of 2 people who have recognized the same country. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I'm sorry too." His name was Robert Calloway. He lived in Grantfield, which was 22 minutes from Kellerton by the highway, in a senior's apartment building called Meadowbrook that he had moved to after Eleanor died because their house had been too large, and the building was no exception. Free regarding the no pets policy, which was why Pearl could not come with him, which he had found devastating in a way he had not fully anticipated, because it was one more thing Eleanor had left behind that he could not keep. He told me all of this in the next 45 minutes. Not quickly. He was not a man who spoke quickly, but steadily, the way a person speaks when they have had no one to tell things to. and have a great deal to say. I sat at my kitchen table and listened, and Pearl sat beside me and also listened, in the manner of cats at a telephone conversation. I told him about Frank, about the apartment on Birch Street, and the parking lot that faced the kitchen window instead of a garden, about Karen and the measuring tape, about the television that I talked to in the evenings. He said, I talk to the radio. I said, at least the radio talks back. He laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him. The laugh of someone who had not expected to laugh that morning. I said, you could come and see her, Pearl, if you wanted to. I'm keeping her, if that's all right. She seems to have decided. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like that very much, if it's not an imposition. I said, it isn't. He came the following Thursday.
I had spent some time deciding whether this was strange. A 70-year-old widower coming to see a cat he had given up at the apartment of a 68-year-old widow he had spoken to once on the phone. I decided it wasn't strange. Or rather, I decided that strange was a criterion that had served me well for most of my life, and that at 68, after 14 months of parking lot smiles and television conversations, I was less interested in it than I used to be.
I had also spent some time on the apartment, which I want to admit because it is the kind of thing I would ordinarily not admit. I did not clean it for Robert. It was already clean. I am a tidy person by nature and had become tidier since Frank died, which the grief books I had read called a coping mechanism, and which I called having something to do with my hands. But I did put away the box of Frank's things that had been sitting in the corner of the living room since November and which I had been meaning to sort for months, and I bought fresh flowers from the shop on the corner, the first I had bought since moving in. I put them on the kitchen table where I thought they would look like I always had flowers, and not like I had specifically bought them for the occasion. Pearl watched all of this from the sofa back with the expression of a cat who sees through things and finds the attempt charming anyway. He was tall, Robert Calloway, taller than I had pictured from his voice, 70, or close to it, with gray hair that had kept most of its thickness, and the kind of face that had once been very handsome and had aged with some dignity and tact. He wore a dark wool jacket over a checked shirt, and he carried a small paper bag from the bakery on Grant Street in Grantfield that he explained he had stopped at on the way, because Eleanor had always said you didn't arrive at someone's house for the first time without bringing something, and he was trying to maintain her standards. He stood in my doorway, holding the paper bag and looking at Pearl, who was sitting on the back of the sofa in the manner of a cat who owns the furniture and is graciously permitting visitors. He said, Pearl. Pearl looked at him. She did not move immediately. She was a cat of considered responses. Then she stepped down from the sofa back and walked to him and headbutted his ankle with a force that suggested genuine feeling. He crouched down, slowly, with the care of a man whose knees had opinions about crouching, and put his hand on her head, and Pearl closed her eyes. I went to put the kettle on because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because I didn't want to look at his face just then. He stayed for 2 hours. We ate the biscuits from the bakery bag, and drank tea, and talked about Eleanor and Frank, with the openness that people sometimes find easier with strangers than with the people who knew them, because strangers have no version of your grief to compare yours to. He told me about Eleanor's rose garden, which had been the thing she was most proud of after their 2 sons. I told him about Frank's workshop in the garage, where he had spent 30 years of weekends building things that were perfectly constructed and entirely useless, an activity I had mocked gently for decades and now found myself grieving with a specificity that surprised me. Robert said, Eleanor used to sing while she was gardening. She had a terrible voice. I could hear it from inside the house, and I always turned the music up a little so she couldn't tell I'd noticed. I said, why? He said, because she loved it, because it made her happy. And it seemed important to let people have the things that make them happy, without making them self-conscious about it. I thought about Frank and his workshop, and the completely useless birdhouses, and the bookshelf that was 4 inches too tall for any wall in our house that he had built anyway, because he had already bought the wood, and I understood exactly what Robert meant. Pearl spent the 2 hours divided between his lap and mine in approximately equal measure, which I thought was diplomatically well judged. When he stood to leave, he said, May I come again to see Pearl? If it's not, I don't want to intrude on your Thursdays. I said Thursdays were fine. He said, next Thursday, then. He came the next Thursday, and the one after that. By the 3rd Thursday, Pearl had stopped dividing her time equally, and had taken to positioning herself precisely between us on the sofa, which was either territorial or diplomatic, depending on how you read Cats. I had started making a proper tea, rather than simply boiling water, which is to say I had bought a teapot and some of the good biscuits from the bakery myself, which Robert pretended not to notice, but I could see he had. We talked about the things that two people in their late 60s and early 70s talk about when they have both lost someone and are not yet sure what they are doing instead. His two sons, who lived in different cities and called regularly and visited less than they called, which he understood and did not fault them for and found lonely nonetheless. My daughter Karen, who lived 40 minutes away and visited more than she needed to and sometimes sat in the kitchen looking at me the way you look at something you're worried about, which I loved and found exhausting in equal measure. We talked about the buildings we lived in, the way a senior's apartment complex makes certain statements about where you are in your life, that you have to decide either to accept or resist, and that neither of us had fully decided. We talked about Eleanor's garden, which his son had offered to maintain, and which Robert had thanked him for, and then quietly arranged to let go fallow, because maintaining it without her felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain, but knew was true. We talked about Frank's workshop, which Karen had suggested clearing, and which I had not cleared, and had no plans to clear, and had finally told her so directly, which had been a difficult conversation and had settled something. On the fourth Thursday, Pearl sat in his lap for the entire visit, and he did not move for 2 hours, even when his tea went cold, because he did not want to disturb her. I refilled his cup around her. He said, "I owe Eleanor an apology." I said, "For what?" He said, "She used to say that when you lose someone you love, you have two choices. You can close up the place where they were, or you can learn to keep living in the space they left." She said she would want me to keep living in the space. I told her she was being dramatic. He stopped. He looked at Pearl. "I've been closing up the place since November. I think she was right and I owe her an apology." I looked at Pearl, who was vibrating at a frequency that suggested deep contentment, and thought about Frank's workshop and the birdhouses and the bookshelf that was 4 inches too tall. I said, "I think they expected us to figure it out eventually." He said, "They had more faith in us than was perhaps warranted." I said, "Probably." We sat for a while after that without talking, which we had started to do comfortably over the preceding weeks. Pearl's purring was the only sound. My daughter Karen found out about the Thursday visits in February. I had not told her deliberately, but I had not hidden it either, and when she called on a Sunday evening, I simply mentioned it in the way you mention things, when they have become ordinary enough that not mentioning them starts to feel like concealment. She said, "Who is Robert?" I said, "He's the man whose wife's cat I found on my doorstep in January." She said, "You found a cat on your doorstep in January?" I said, "Yes, I have a cat now. Her name is Pearl." Karen was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for Karen. Then she said, "Mom, are you doing okay?" I said, "Yes. Better, actually."
Thursdays help.
She said, "I want to meet him." I said it was too soon for that. She said, "It's been 6 weeks." I said, "Karen." She said, "Okay. But I want to meet Pearl." Robert's son Thomas found out around the same time and called his father to ask a series of questions that Robert told me about the following Thursday, with an expression of fond exasperation that was clearly the expression he had been making at Thomas since Thomas was approximately 14. Robert said, he asked if I was being careful. I said, "What did you say?" He said, "I said I was 70 years old and had been a careful man my entire life, and that careful had served me very well, and also left me talking to the radio for 3 months, and I wasn't sure I wanted to keep being careful about this particular thing." I said, "That's a very good answer." He said, Thomas said, "To give him your number in case of emergency." I said, "What kind of emergency?" He said he didn't specify. Robert's mouth did the thing it did when he was about to say something dry. I think he was imagining the category broadly. I laughed. Pearl looked up from the sofa arm with the mild disdain of a cat who finds human laughter undignified. There was an afternoon in March that I want to tell you about, because it was when I understood what was happening, or rather, when I admitted to myself what I had already understood for some time. It was a Thursday, as it always was. Robert had arrived at 2 o'clock with biscuits from the Grant Street Bakery and a small packet of the specific cat treats that Pearl had determined she preferred, which he had noticed her preference for on the second Thursday, and had brought every Thursday since without mentioning it. We had been sitting in the small living room with the kettle recently emptied, and Pearl between us on the sofa, and we had been talking about something. I cannot now remember what, and Robert had laughed at something I said. Not the short surprised laugh of the first phone call. A full laugh. The kind that takes up space in a room. The kind that told you what a person had been like before grief had made them smaller. I thought, I like this man. And then immediately, I have been liking this man for 8 weeks. And then, more slowly, Frank would have liked him too. That last thought surprised me enough that I must have shown it on my face because Robert stopped laughing and looked at me with the attention he always paid. The kind that noticed things. He said, "What?" I said, "I was thinking about Frank." He said, "Yes?" I said, "I was thinking he would have liked you." He liked people who said exactly what they meant. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor would have liked you. She liked people who didn't make a fuss about things that didn't require a fuss." We looked at each other across the sofa, across Pearl, across 8 weeks of Thursdays and whatever they had accumulated into. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, because I think it matters. It did not feel like betrayal. It did not feel like replacement or erasure or any of the things I had quietly worried about during the long, quiet evenings of the preceding months. It felt like a room that had been closed for a long time and was open again, and the air coming in was cold, but it was also fresh, and I had forgotten that fresh and cold were not the same as wrong. Frank was not less present because Robert was sitting across from me. If anything, thinking about what Frank would have made of him made Frank feel closer. The specific shape of his personality suddenly present in the room because I was measuring someone against it. I did not know what to do with that, but I decided to sit with it instead of pushing it away. I said, "Robert?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I'm not sure what to call this." He said, "No, neither am I." I said, "I don't think it matters what we call it." He said, "No, I don't think it does either." Pearl, who had been watching this exchange with the yellow-green eyes that Eleanor had apparently trusted for good reason, stood up and walked one step to the left and lay down with her head on my thigh and her hindquarters on his knee, distributing herself between us with the confidence of an animal that has made a decision and sees no reason to discuss it. We both looked at her. Robert said, "She's done it again." I said, "She always knows." He said, "Eleanor always said that." I said, "Eleanor was right." He reached across Pearl very carefully, so as not to disturb her, and put his hand over mine on the sofa cushion. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Outside the parking lot window, the March light was coming in pale and clear, the first light in months that felt like it meant something. April came. Pearl had been mine for 3 months, and had taken the apartment over with the quiet efficiency of a cat who has lived in good homes and knows how to make one. She had a spot on the kitchen windowsill for mornings, a spot on the bedroom radiator for cold evenings, and the sofa arm for Thursdays. She had a way of appearing at my side in the kitchen while I was cooking that reminded me of the way Frank used to do the same thing, not to help but to be present, which was its own kind of help. Karen came to meet Pearl in April. She sat on the sofa, and Pearl walked directly to her and sat in her lap, which Karen had not expected, and which softened her immediately in a way that took me a moment to understand. Pearl was the first animal she had ever seen in my apartment, and something about a cat making itself at home in my lap had reassured Karen about things she couldn't say directly. She looked around the apartment, at the kitchen with the actual teapot on the counter, and the good biscuits in the tin, and the cat's bowls by the refrigerator, and the small framed photograph of Frank that I had finally put on the bookshelf, and she said, "Mom, you seem different." I said, "Different? How?" She said, less careful. "In a good way." I thought about Robert saying the same word differently, and said, "I think that might be right." She met Robert in May. I had decided to stop managing the timing and simply let things happen in their natural order, which they did on a Saturday afternoon when Robert came to drop off a book he had mentioned, and Karen happened to be there, having stayed for lunch. It was not a planned meeting, and it was not a difficult one. Karen asked him questions in the direct way she asks everything. She has always been more like Frank than she knows, and Robert answered them with the patience and exactness that I had come to recognize as entirely characteristic. When Robert had gone, Karen sat at my kitchen table for a while. She said, "He's good, Mom." I said, "I know." She said, "He laughs at you." I said, "What?" She said, "I mean, he laughs at the things you say. Like he's really listening. Like he thinks you're funny. Dad used to do that." I hadn't thought of it that way. But she was right. Frank had always laughed at my jokes as though they surprised him, even when he had heard the same joke 3 times, which I had attributed to generosity, and which I now thought might have been something more than that, might have been the particular attentiveness of a person who is still curious about you after many years. And Robert had the same quality, and I was grateful Karen had named it. I said, "I know." She said, "Okay." And then she said quietly, "I think Pearl knew." I looked at the cat, who was sitting on the kitchen windowsill, watching a bird in the parking lot with the focused intention of an animal who has no expectation of catching it but finds the watching worthwhile. I said, "I think she did." Robert and I were sitting in the garden of the Meadowbrook building one evening. In June, there was a small courtyard with benches that residents could use, and the policy about no pets meant Pearl was not with us, which was the only thing wrong with the evening. When Robert said something I had been thinking about for some time, he said, "Dorothy." I said yes. He said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I have learned, at 70, that plain is better." I said, "I know. Say it." He said, "I am not replacing Eleanor. I have no interest in replacing Eleanor. She was the person I built my life with, and she is part of every room I walk into, and I would not have it any other way. But I have come to think, over these past months, that she would be very impatient with me if I spent whatever time I have left talking to the radio and being careful about things that don't require it." He stopped. He looked at the courtyard garden, which was modest but well kept, and at the June evening light on the hedges. He said, "I would like to keep having Thursdays. I would like to keep having more than Thursdays. I am not proposing anything you're not ready for. I am simply saying that whatever this is, I don't want to stop." I had been sitting with this for 3 months, turning it over in the particular private way that is different from thinking about it with someone else. I had talked to Frank about it in my head, which is a thing I do still and am not embarrassed to admit. I had asked him what he thought. He had not answered, of course, but I had a reasonable sense of what he would have said, which was something like, "Dorothy, you have always been very good at overthinking things and very slow at doing them, and at 68, I would have thought you might have made some progress on that." I said, "Robert." He looked at me. I said, "I have been waiting for you to say that for approximately 10 weeks. He was very still for a moment. Then the full laugh came, the room-filling one, the one that told you who he had been before November and who he was becoming again. He said, "Eleanor always said I was slow." I said, "Frank said the same about me." It seems we were well matched in that way, too. He took my hand. We sat in the small courtyard garden in the June evening, and the light went slowly the way it does in Ohio in June, taking its time, and Pearl was inside somewhere on my sofa, being proprietary about the cushions, and my daughter Karen would have opinions when I told her, and Robert's son Thomas would have a separate set of opinions, and all of that was fine, and none of it was the most important thing. The most important thing was that a gray and white cat with yellow-green eyes, and the good judgment that Eleanor had always credited her with, had sat down on my doorstep on the coldest night of January and looked up at me and waited. And I had let her in. I am 68 years old. I did not expect to find anything on my doorstep in January except the cold. I did not expect a cat to change the direction of a winter, or a note in a collar to be the beginning of a phone call, or a phone call to be the beginning of Thursdays, or Thursdays to become what they have become. Pearl is asleep on the bedroom radiator as I write this. She has been mine for 7 months, and Robert's for the 6 years before that, and Eleanor's completely before that, and she has distributed her loyalty with the same careful equity with which she distributes herself across sofas. She is old for a cat, and I do not let myself think too far ahead on that subject. What I know is that she sits in the kitchen window in the mornings and watches the parking lot as though it might, at any moment, offer something worth seeing, and I have begun to take the same view of it myself. Frank would have called that progress. He would have said it with the laugh that still surprises me, even in memory. I think he would have been right. And I think Eleanor's cat, who I have long since stopped calling a stray, because Pearl is the least stray animal I have ever encountered, being precisely where she intended to be from the moment she sat down on my step. I think she knew all along that the cold was temporary, and the door would open, and whatever came next was worth waiting for. It was.